Folks, thanks for your patience. We've had some technical issues had to get sorted out before we started today, but we don't actually have this week, I don't think, any events to announce other than on Friday.
It's Vida. Edward Vida on Siberian Languages
Right.
at 10:30 in the morning. Alderson, maybe?
Alderson and Kansas City.
That's what I feel like.
All
I'm
right.
just getting these vibes. It must be Alderson.
Thanks, Edith. All right, our speaker today is Lesley Rimmel from the Department of History at the Oklahoma State University, and she is also a Crease Fellow. She's been working with our center and spending some time up here working on a project which examines the relationship between government propaganda, popular beliefs, and political participation of ordinary citizens in the Stalin terror of the 1930s. And so I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Crease, for this invitation, which I really appreciate. I've loved working here. I really enjoy the library. I'm just wandering around the stacks and seeing all the books that I didn't even know about. And talking with people, exchanging ideas, and just being up here, of course, during some interesting events, which kind of right in my backyard. I'm living right nearby. I mean, I know what it's like to go through these sorts of things, and especially if you're faculty, you don't really know what to expect from the students. But I think Kansas has done very well. Okay, well, the title of this talk, as advertised, which Bart worked very hard to wrest from me earlier this year, was somewhat misleading or perhaps too general. Scapegoat Nation, Leningrad and the Terror. The actual focus will be on the show trials, or on a show's trial and its perception in Leningrad Oblast in 1937. The Great Moscow Show Trials defined for many the essence of the Stalin regime, and for a long time stood as the public symbols of the Great Terror and the battle against so-called enemies of the people. With their filmed dramatic scenes of once powerful leaders abjectly confessing to having committed fantastic crimes, the trials captivated observers throughout much of the Western world who had access to the films. The question is, did they capture the imagination of Soviet citizens? Okay, well, the show trial behind today's talk is the January 1937 trial of the so-called parallel anti-Soviet Trotskyite Center, known colloquially as the Pyatakov trial, or the parallel trial. It named Pyatakov trial after the name of the lead defendant, Yuri or Georgy Leonidovich Pyatakov. But this trial, along with the two other major Moscow show trials, the August 1936 trial of the, quote, anti-Soviet United Trotskyite Zinoviev Center, often referred to as the Zinoviev trial, and then the March 1938 trial of the anti-Soviet right Trotskyite bloc, or colloquially the Bukharin trial, have been the subject of much scholarly work, both in the 60s and 70s, and then again during the past decade. Recent works include innovative and provocative studies on the trials as ritual, the trials as theater, show trials as teaching tools. And after all, that's what the show trials were. They're show trials of pokazatelny proces, to pokazat, to show, to demonstrate something, in addition to being a spectacle, as we usually see the word show. Okay, so these are trials of demonstration, illustration, instruction. The three Moscow trials, the famous, infamous Moscow trials of the 1930s, were the culmination of many other ones occurring both before and during the Big Three, from the 1918 trial of Countess Sofia Panina, the 1922 trial of the Socialist Revolutionaries, and the numerous 1920s agit trials that were purely pedagogical and had no formal connection with the legal system. All the way to the 35 or more local show trials held during the height of the terror, which I hope to get to later. Not today, but later. And also one could designate certain Tsarist era trials as precursors, the open trials. My purpose today, however, is not to analyze any of these trials. They've been pretty well picked over by this point. But I'll introduce some basic information, since Moscow show trial is no longer a household expression that it once was, and just to review it for others. The basic storyline, the accusation of all the trials was the same, pretty much. You have Trotsky, Stalin's exiled one-time arch-rival, had organized several underground centers within the Soviet Union to overthrow the USSR and undermine socialism. The centers were people allegedly with Stalin's former opponents of the 1920s, none of whom by the 30s posed any kind of threat. Most of them were working, quietly in economic commissariats, etc. The first one, the August 1936 trial of Grigory Zinoviev, Lev Kamenev, and 14 others, used the December 1934 murder of Leningrad party chief Sergei Kirov as its justification. And so political assassinations and alleged attempts to overthrow the government were the main concerns. The next trial, the January 1937 trial, which featured as defendants erstwhile allies of Trotsky, who'd long since renounced him, focused on purported sabotage of industry within the country and alliances externally with Nazi Germany, Japan, and Poland, countries which would help take over the USSR and restore capitalism. The third major show trial in March 1938 tried to combine the features of the first two, with the right Trotskyist bloc, which none of these, of course, make any sense. Interestingly, the 1937 trial has received less attention from scholars, except for those who have focused on industrialization, economic management, or labor history. Now, the first trial, the 1936 trial, was shocking because it represented the first time that the party state had executed not only one-time party leaders, but Lenin's own close comrades, two men whom he even named in his testament. The 1938 trial holds continual fascination, largely because of its more complicated and interesting defendants. First and foremost, Nikolai Bukharin, who, unlike the ultimately pathetic figure of Zinoviev, attempted to preserve for himself a modicum of dignity, and emerged from history as a relatively tragic figure. Now, all these people were quite happily sending others to execution chambers, especially as things got a little bit stressful towards the end. Bukharin also had a year in prison to reflect and write about his life and thoughts. The Pyatakov trial, on the other hand, while not without some interesting exchanges in the courts, seemed to have come across mostly as a prologue to the February-March 1937 Central Committee plenum, itself a prelude to the full unleashing of the terror. All of these main four characters were named in Lenin's testament. Bukharin was more the star, than the others. But when we look at the 1937 trial from the perspective of propaganda intended for internal consumption, it appears to be more significant than the other two. For the case of the parallel anti-Soviet Trotskyite Center was the object of a huge propaganda campaign, propaganda and agitation campaign, that the regime seemed determined that everyone from party organizations at all levels to the members of the most remote Sovieti and Kolkhozy and housewives organizations, all these people should be kept informed and up to date on the progress of the trials and to take from it the proper lessons. The propaganda apparatus, especially at the rayon or district level, organized seminari to prepare members of the local agit kollektivi, who would then fan out throughout the rayoni and conduct meetingi, sobrania, besiedi, chitki, and even radio slushania, probably a few other types that I will mention later. These discussion leaders, many of whom were party leaders, party members rather, would then send detailed reports to the Raikom, the Rayon Party Committee leadership, on how many gatherings they'd led, the total number of people attending, how many made vystuplenia, statements, the number and content of questions asked, and the most characteristic comments. Negative or unhealthy statements were also noted. Those are the terms they used. Now, I keep wondering, and maybe some of you have answers, why did the regime appear to concentrate its domestic public opinion efforts on this particular Moscow trial and not on the other two? Other studies involving terror in society, if they reference the show trials at all, give mentions only to the Pyatikov trial. The Leningrad Oblast documents that I've looked at and that others have looked at seem to have only materials for this trial. Now, there are several possible explanations. Perhaps materials connected to the 1936 and 38 trials were never declassified. Or maybe, despite my having worked seemingly endlessly over the years in the former Leningrad Party archive, I ran out of time and never saw those other documents, if they exist, or maybe I just overlooked them. But then, so must everybody else have done. But I believe there's something deeper here at play. The August 1936 show trial, while, as we noted, was hardly the first show trial to garner national and international attention, took the practice to a completely new level. The defendants having clearly been party and state leaders, and not just lower level engineers and managers. Perhaps Stalin and his associates were unsure if the 1936 trial would turn out as scripted, and so they wanted to gauge its success first. And so when the Zinoviev trial did turn out as the leadership wished, that is, there were no demonstrations or protests within the country or serious foreign policy complications, although the regime was made aware of residual support for Zinoviev in some quarters, Stalin et al. Could feel confident about organizing a propaganda effort around the next trial. The Pyatikov trial would also concern topics to which many ordinary people could actually relate. Some of these, fantastic schemes that Zinoviev was supposed to have concocted, or at Trotsky's orders, actually were not your everyday kind of idea for ordinary people. But with the second trial, the issues were the industrialization process, worker safety, railway safety, and the fear of war. So why then was there not a similar campaign around the third show trial? Well, here it's safe to argue that party staffing levels were simply inadequate by March 1938, especially in Leningrad. Statistics on party membership bear this out for the 30s. Sorry about these numbers I'm going to throw at you, but it'll make sense at the end. In early 1933, for example, the number of party members and candidates in the oblast, the surrounding area, and the city proper was 278,289, so almost 280,000, of which 79% lived in the city proper, while the city's overall population was only 40% of the combined city and oblast population of almost 7 million. So obviously the city is far better represented with party members. I'm sure the rural people were probably very happy about that. But by 1938, however, the total number of communists in the combined city and oblast had dropped to just under 150,000. So from almost 280,000 to 150,000. It's quite a drop. And most of these 123,000 were based in the city. So now the city had an even more disproportionate coverage. Okay, so to restate this in a more comprehensible fashion, as I promised, this means that by 37, 38, there was one communist for every 18 city residents, but only one communist per 160 oblast residents. Okay, so quite a difference, and you'll hear lots of complaining about we need more party people to come and work out here. Okay, and party secretaries were also very frequently replaced during this tumultuous decade. So many Raioni were being run by novices, making organizational efforts even more challenging. Meanwhile, the party was not accepting new members. From January 1933, when there was a massive party purge, to November 1936, after the verification and exchange of party cards was finished. And of course, party secretaries were especially busy in mid-1937 from mid-1937 to late 1938, helping to facilitate the work of the murderous troika and participating, but often as both perpetrator and victim, in the party purges of the time, which of course hit Leningrad via its party membership very strongly. Okay, so in other words, 1938 was a hard year for having a propaganda campaign. That's my theory. Okay, well, the Leningrad area, and by that, again, I mean the combined city and oblast. And here we have this wonderful map that Dr. Dinas has brought for us. And it provides a particularly favorable setting for studying popular opinion. But what constituted Leningrad was constantly changing in the 1930s, especially from 1934 to 37. It underwent numerous redistrictings, and by early 1937, it was at its peak size in the Soviet era. At that time, it had 5 city party organizations or jurisdictions, including that of the Leningrad City organization, 9 Raioni within Leningrad City, 72 rural Raioni, and 3 okruga, Murmansk, Pskov, Kimissev. The oblast also included Novgorod, plus Karelia was informally considered a part of the Leningrad fiefdom, especially as long as Andrei Donov, Kirov's successor, was in charge. So we'll get some of their opinions. So the Leningrad region was huge, much larger than it is today. And it included much linguistic diversity, although it's overwhelmingly ethnic Russian. The city in 37 was 86% Great Russian, the oblast minus the city 90%. But nearly 5% of the oblast population was Finnic, so Finnish, Estonian, Veps, and their languages, not to mention their possible possible ties to hostile elements in provinces of the former Russian Empire, created organizing impediments, not to mention potential suspicion on the part of the government. So there were lots of arrests and actually executions for border crossings during this time. Okay, well, today we'll examine the propaganda campaign results in 26 of the rural Raioni. Obviously, we don't have time to go through more than maybe 1 or 2. And the 3 okruga, although primarily the city part of Murmansk. There's also 1 railroad line included as a separate jurisdiction. And there are some interesting results from Leningrad City. My sources, as I mentioned, come from the former Leningrad Party Archive since 1991, called the Central State Archive of Historical and Political Documents in St. Petersburg. Thus, the reports are largely from the party and mostly from the Department of Political Propaganda and Agitation, a central committee department that had subdivisions down to the Raion level. And the So that's the level we'll be discussing. Some of the reports were sent to another important central committee department, Department of Leading Party Organs, or ORPO, which had departments down to the oblast level. And this department was concerned with party cadres, and its head, until he became NKVD chief, was Nikolai Yezhov. So he already knew a lot about who was doing what. ORPO, in turn, collected these reports and, if necessary, sent a digest of them to the special sector, Stalin's secret communications network. Now, I've worked with all these, but for this I've tried to rely mostly on the propaganda and agitation reports because they're the most raw, they're closest to the original sources, the people who spoke or made the remarks or reported on them. Tattled on them. The digests from ORPO and special sector were more likely to be edited. Okay, and there were some reports originating in other departments, Department of Press and Publishers, Department of Cultural Educational Work, but we won't look at those today. Okay, so how exactly did the campaign work? It was well organized, at least at the top, and a number of party functionaries provided very detailed descriptions of the burst of activity that ensued once the announcement was made that the defendants were going to trial. The trial itself, by the way, was January 23rd to the 30th. Okay, so one example, the Deputy Secretary of the Pestovsky Raikom wrote that the process began actually on the 21st of January, when they got the communique from the USSR Procuracy about the trial. All primary party organizations were instructed to organize mass meetings. Okay, so in fact, this is interesting in that that's the order came there, and in fact, some of the reports were sent back to the Procuracy, which probably wasn't all that interested in what they had to say. Okay, so this is just on the, just as a lot of areas were finishing up their Lenin's birthday observances. Okay, well, on January 24th, the party organizations were directed to study specifically the indictment of Unitnaya Zaključenja, which had just been published in Leningradskaya Pravda. During the next, as they discussed this during the next general party meeting. So in this case, in Trotsky, Rayon 11, party organizers attended, thus fortified. They held a seminar for the propagandists from the network of communist enlightenment. These are for the journalists who were going to write the specialized relevant articles for the Rayon and other press. And so they had to learn the essence of the anti-Soviet Trotskyite center. The day also included a meeting for the agitatori, the agitators, the party's ground troops who would actually go out and travel to the various far-flung Selsovieti and Kolkhozy and help them study the trial. So that 23 agitatori were sent down. By the way, traditionally there was a strict difference between propaganda and agitation. Propaganda, according to Lenin's definition, was strictly written, and it was deep information for a select group of people. Agitation was less deep and more widespread, but these are getting a little bit blurred this time. I'm just going to use the word propaganda most of the time. Okay, then the next big day, January 30th, Rayon party members and sympathizers, a total of 42 people met, and on receiving the news of the verdict by the Supreme Court's military collegium, they held a mass meeting of 500 in the village of Peskovo. That's what the meeting is. Okay, and there they were to express their opinions and vote in favor of the verdict. All in all, according to incomplete data, the event encompassed 5,700 people, while discussions were still ongoing. the main object of discussion were the indictment and the verdict. The indictment being very long, although presumably easier to read in the Siège number than in microfilm. Although you can also read it in English, this whole transcript of the trial. Okay. Kashirin, the party deputy secretary, noted that people were also gathering around radio points where they existed and were enthusiastically listening to developments in the trial. In fact, radio had just started to begin in the Oblast. Okay, but radio or no radio, the ability to hold effective meetings was dependent on the appearance of Leningrad Scapegoat, and there were a lot of complaints about it not showing up on time. Okay, well, there are lots and lots of criticisms from some of the people involved, usually the so-called instructori. These were the actual people who were to explain things, to instruct. They would write either to the Reichscom secretary or sometimes higher, but those tended to be the most critical. Part of that had to do with the tradition of Kritika and Samokritika, but some of them had very specific issues. Some of the people who were leading discussions, besiedchiki, were not very qualified. They either gave wrong answers, they didn't show up, and sometimes though it was the whole communist party organization that didn't show up. Part of the problem is that these were held during lunch break. They no longer, ever since industrialization, they no longer held these meetings during work time, because that was a waste. So people would be kind of held hostage at work, at lunch breaks, and workers in many places here found ways to go have lunch elsewhere. Okay. Most of the complaints come from the Finnish areas, and they were very interesting to me. Krasnogvardeyski Rayon and Kingisepsky Okrug have big proportions. I think I can find Krasnogvardeyski. It is the once and future Gachina, so it's around here. So it's not really that far away, but for some reason, when you read about it, it seems like it could be, somewhere up in the Arctic or something, because they're just, they're totally understaffed with Finnish language people. Okay, and this affects especially the kolhoznici, the women. All right. Well, I think what I'm going to do is, although this is quite fascinating to me, all the problems, because that's how you learn how the meeting is supposed to go when you read about how it didn't work out. Some of the party secretaries, the Rayon secretaries, unlike the instructori, were keen to show that everything was working wonderfully, and they would list these huge figures, and even Krasnogvardeyski Rayon, the instructor Kartanen, Finnish language speaker, well, he actually didn't give the great numbers, but his boss did. So something like 20,000 people get involved in all the different levels of discussions. Okay. Now, one of the things that's really interesting is the questions. They always list the questions asked. And unfortunately, they don't always describe who asked the questions. But let's get to that. But just from the questions, which some of which, well, I must say that I was not expecting them to be as interesting as they were. Okay. Now, we have to remember, first of all, though, before judging them, and I'll just pick some of the better ones, that it's hard to judge their reactions, partly because, especially from the point of view of right now, or even 20 years ago, or even 40 years ago, as someone who's been exposed to Western and samizdat writings, we know a lot more than these people on the ground did. Okay, so finding out what they actually knew is difficult, and we can't judge by our own knowledge. We had Medvedev and others who wrote books early on. Also, I wasn't expecting very high levels of questions from the Rayoni in the Oblast, because I guess one of the first memoirs I ever read was Maria Yoffe's Badnan Noch, One Long Night. And she's the second wife and widow of Adolf Yoffe, who was a colleague of Trotsky's and committed suicide in 1927 when he saw the way the country was going. She ended up in the Gulag for quite a long time and had some pretty horrific experiences. I remember, though, specifically her observations that how she encountered the rural folk, that they seemed clueless about high political matters, and they even misunderstood the term Trotskyist as tractorist. Okay, so I was expecting a lot of really dumb questions, quote unquote, questions, unsophisticated ones, but instead, many of them, the questions demonstrated a keen interest in events and personalities, and even challenged the regime to defend itself. For example, one of the most common questions was a variant of this. If Pyatakov, Radek, and other rectors were so utterly despicable, why were they allowed to have leadership positions in the first place and stay there right up until the previous year? Okay, it's just, they weren't that dumb, okay? So, because they'd seen all these faces before. I would love, we don't get always the answers that the poor Besedchiki gave. Related to that was the question of why Radek, Sokolnikov, and others, the top leaders, so Radek being a very important Comintern person and journalist, and Pyatakov himself being the deputy commissar of heavy industry. Sorry, I had to mention that. Others, anyway, why were these others not unmasked during the verification and exchange of party cards, which had just taken place? Wasn't that what it was all about? One person went back even further and wondered why Radek, Pyatakov, and Trotsky were not expelled from the Communist Party when they opposed the Brest-Litovsk peace in 1918. Okay, so the questions token a certain lack of confidence in the government's competence, or in its consistency at least. Another recurring question related to that was why Trotsky was allowed to go abroad. Was he sent abroad? Why wasn't he shot while he still lived in the Soviet Union? And the government, was the government going to go back and get him and put him on trial as an enemy of the people? Because every minute there's something bad about Trotsky. The varying fates of the defendants were also of interest. Why weren't they all shot, especially Radek? There were 4 of the 17 who got prison sentences, but they all died not too long thereafter. So Radek his gloating was in vain. People wondered about the fate of Bukharin and the rights, which had been left up in the air in this trial. Why was nothing being written about him in the papers? The trial had shown that they were all participants in counter-revolutionary activity. There were the occasional basic questions like, what is the parallel center? And what does it mean? Of course, it meant that this was a center parallel to the one in the first show trial. Okay, so just 2 of Trotsky's centers. But others demonstrated they'd been paying attention to the earlier show trial, such as when they asked why current defendants what the current defendants had in common with the fascist band tried in 1936, and why Pyatakov and the others were not tried with them. Some questioners were curious about foreign policy implications of the defendants' activities. I mean, if all these things are happening and if all these secrets have been sold to Nazi Germany and Japan, you know, are we in terrible shape? We're about to be attacked probably. And then the most intriguing questions, of course, and they still are, were those concerning confession. Why, a lot of people ask, were the Trotsky, why did they confess in such detail about their treasonous activities? You know, we know torture, you know, conveyor, blackmailing, all kinds of things. As I said, the answers of the besieged were not recorded. When we get to the vystuplenia, the comments, I'll mention a few of these, there we find out more about the actual participants, because usually if somebody makes a negative comment, they're described. Usually there's some reason for why they would make a comment. Not that it made sense, the negative comment, but just there's something in that person's background that's very suspicious. Now, as I've written elsewhere, it's really impossible to, of course, know how many people made what comments, how many really supported the regime, what proportion just was going along with it, pretending to, how many opposed it, how many couldn't care less. We get all those opinions in here. But if you look at enough of them, and I've looked at hundreds, you can find patterns. Now, I haven't sorted them out yet, so I don't have all the patterns. And enough, that's always a good question. However many you're allowed to see, the doors shut in the former Leningrad Party archive at the end of the last decade, I should say the 90s. But I got as many as I could. So it's really difficult to judge the positive statements, which are always listed to show that the instructor or the Rayon chief is doing what they're supposed to do. Usually the speakers are repeating the words of Leningradskaya Pravda verbatim. Is it because they just don't know how to express themselves on these issues, or they just feel that repeating these shtampi are what is expected? Okay, but the people making the reports do always say these are the majority, and then they give a lot of negative ones, or a number of them, so it's hard to say. But the negative ones are always in non-stereotype language. And I had to do, when I first was looking at these, I had to ask a lot of native Russian speakers, what is this word? And they kind of, look at me in horror, and I said that word out loud. I didn't know what it wasn't in the dictionary. But, so I learned to be a little more careful, like show it to them and not say it. Okay. Okay, now based on materials I've examined in the past, I did expect a lot of the negative comments to focus on Blut and on economic matters, and I wasn't disappointed. There were a lot of complaints about snabzhenia, the provisioning, during the trial. And here's one really interesting one. Raikom Secretary Novikov of Lychkovsky Rayon, which is a real hotbed of all kinds of things, sent a supplementary report to the Leningrad Oblast Orpo about an emergency situation. On the day that the trial had begun, long red lines had suddenly formed in the Rayon Center. Apparently, supplies of flour had disappeared, and local supply representatives couldn't find any fallback ones. So officials rushed into action to look for flour. They discovered a few truckfuls at a station outside the center, and in order to liquidate lines, everything's liquidated, the officials had to commandeer 2 cars to take the supplies back to town, and the situation improved. Now, a careful investigation afterwards indicated that the local supply bodies had planned this to happen just as the trial started. Now, not all the sites of economic complaint were quite this dramatic. However, it is possible that the plot to hide the flour, was a case of scapegoating, keeping in the spirit of the times, to conceal the government's lack of organization. Whatever the actual cause of the shortage, authorities were acutely worried about the probable outcome, anger and dissatisfaction. Okay. Let's see. I'll just give you some of the other examples. Now, in the Slavkovsky Rayon, there were a lot of positive statements, but then some hostile ones. So, for example, in the Krasnaya Luka kolhoz, the party of the instructor characterized, somebody who was attending, characterized the purges as an example of how, quote, in Moscow, the pomeshchiki were all fighting among themselves. These intergroup struggles do nothing to make our lives easier.
Nice word.
Yeah, well, I think, I don't know how old he was. Sometimes if there is an old timer, they mention that. It goes on to say, grain goes to the state. We sell it for 1 ruble per pud, and buying grain costs us 30 rubles. Okay. Now, let's see. In the Djedovichki, I think, Rayon, the instructor there reported a depressed attitude. And discussion leaders were unable to keep people focused on politics. As the non-party deputy president of the Mushino Kolhoz mused, life is hard, there's little bread, not enough oats, no bread in the stores. The mood among the kolhozniki is bad, they rarely discuss politics. Even we are not concerned with this work. Okay, if the people coming out to give the propaganda aren't interested, that's not good. Okay, now a lot more of these. Here in Okolovsky Rayon, in the Cell Soviet, in the kolhoz, an accountant, Smirnov, observed, they can't kill off all the Trotskyists. After all, everyone knows that life was easier before the revolution than now. And he added, Trotskyists were and will be right. He sounds like present-day Trotskyists. Okay, so to finish up here so we can look at some pictures and talk. Not everyone agreed with Stalin at this time that Žid stala lucha, Žid stala veselее. And he and Zhdanov were pushing hard to get propaganda away from the economic and the discussions away from the economic and over to the more political, Zhdanov especially. Now, did they succeed? So far it doesn't look like it, but that's just preliminary. So that's one of the things I'm trying to look to examine. Okay, so major problems in getting the word out and maybe the effort it took. And some people really made major efforts. I mean, there were just all kinds of activities and events going on, but a little too much for 1938. Okay, so I want to conclude by showing some political cartoons and posters that caricatured some of the main figures in the 1937 trial. I don't think they were in like Izvestia or some other major national or all-union papers, but not in Leningradskaya Pravda. And they will also hint at what's not in the comments. So let's see, that's on. Okay. Let's see. It's too late to read the manual. Okay, now should I make this bigger?
There's a dial you can spin there.
Sorry?
There's a
Oh,
dial
the dial, okay. Ooh, I have
to
a
enlarge
plus
or
and minus.
reduce. There you go.
All right, now he's got this sort of star on him.
Move it a little bit to another point.
Sorry, move
Just
it to
move
another
it,
point.
yeah.
Now
You
there's
still
that.
have it, but
You don't
it's
want
not-
that halo on.
Yeah.
Oh, well, we'll give him. All right, so this is that clear enough for you? They're not These are from the original posters. They took them from the Leningrad photographic museum. Oh, okay, there we go. They're all different. Remember, there's their own logo. But I was kind of
Better?
Yes.
okay. Good, thank you. That kind of amazed me. I mean, it looks like they have a problem with professors or something. He doesn't look like he's about to go and cause some major issues. Although if you look at what in his pocket, you probably can't read it. It's a message that says what Trotsky. Okay, so he's dreaming up what he's going to do to answer Trotsky's call. Okay, and here we see this depicted even more graphically. Trotsky, who is sitting on the boots of the Nazis, hardly, is directly giving the gun to Pyatakov, to get things rolling. Okay. So, and then here we have him. Oops, sorry. I don't know. He's got his party card right there. I guess he's pretending to be a loyal party member, even though he's doing all these other dastardly things. Right, this next one, and these are Buddies of Femov, I think. They're not as, they're sort of atypical. This one maybe you all can help me with. This is, obviously he's in the spirit of wrecking, blowing up something. I don't know if this is like something in the mine that helps get the water out, because one of the big issues was the big mining accident in Kemerovo at the time. And that would come up a lot, and all the people that were killed, ordinary people like you and me, this was the sort of thing that was mentioned. Okay, so I'm not a mining expert, but I think that might be it.
That's the pneumatic hammer.
Oh, okay.
Pneumatic hammer.
Oh, okay. Oh, all right. Well, she's blasting something then. All right, good, thank you. I couldn't really tell.
It's the face of the mine, and this is pneumatic hammer.
Okay, great.
It's not fracking, no, fracking.
Okay, good. All right, now, let's look at more of those. Okay, one more from him, and then, actually, we have a few. We'll go that way. This one looks like one of his earlier efforts. Oops, see that. And it's labeled for us. Here he's offering the blood of the Soviet toilers, the German fascists. Am I blocking this or anything?
No.
Mm-mm. All right. And the bottom, okay, there, Gaspardias is proof of our creditworthiness. And that's what they're going to deliver to the Gestapo, get them to help overthrow the Soviet Union. Trotsky and Pyatakov. All right, now we have more people, and I'll need your help on this one too. Okay. So there, we're Trotsky and Pyatakov on the left of the trio, and on the right, Radak. And I'm not sure who the smaller guy, he looks like Franco, but I don't know why he's there. And they're selling the country. You can have it either wholesale or retail. And so the country's for sale, and that's what we're doing. Now look at Radak a little bit. And here we have him again in his job. He was, very involved in trade issues, but not quite the way we described it. Okay, so here he is trading away their motherland. This is a different cartoonist, and the company is the Togovigon Trotsky Company, selling parts of the Soviet Union to the bourgeois. Okay. So notice how Radak is portrayed. And then here's one last one. This will just bring me to my last. Okay, so here's Trotsky, and here's Trotsky. Judeo-Masonic plot. So this makes me wonder, I came across so much anti-Semitism when I was looking at the Kirov murder. People just brought it up without any prompting. And here, I only saw it twice. Once it was in the Leningrad city, which I didn't get to in these comments, and then the government, okay, which is supposed to be against it, but they're not so subtly encouraging it. So, and the other one I encountered, and that many others have, is from Lyubov Shapotina in her diary, in that collection of excerpts from diaries that Sandy Corus and others edited in the 90s. And she's a very educated, Shapotina, cultural person in Leningrad. And those are the ones who are making these comments, not these farm folk. You know, they're not interested in that. So, one of my mysteries that need to be solved. Thank you very much, and I welcome your suggestions.
Will you take a few questions?
Oh, I would love to, yes.
The second part of that saying,